that are translations of Nephis Levi, the Parisian Magus in there. I could not understand, how did this thing come to be? And I asked him, and he knew very little about it. It was a mystery. So that set me on a course of seeking to get the information behind this book, this newspaper. And at the time, I couldn't find anything. I found a little bit of information about some of the writers, like Alexander Wilder, who was a fascinating character. And I kept looking. I went to all the college libraries. I went everywhere I could. There was no internet. It was just the very beginnings of the internet at that time. So the nice thing that happened was, in the 90s, and then with a vengeance in the 2000s and on, academia had a revolution, which was they suddenly decided that it was good to study esoteric information. Because before that, in religious studies in particular, you never looked at it. It was considered superstitious idiocy. And it was considered radical to look at the Pentecostals, because your job as a historian was to look at the big institutions that had shaped civilization, the big churches. And all of a sudden, a new spirit enlivened academia, where the idea was, we're not here to judge this stuff. This is history. And we need to open up all these archives that have never been looked at, and we need to apply our academic skills to understanding what were these people doing and why were they saying these things. And we're not going to say it's stupid or it's brilliant. We're just going to tell you, this is what they said, this is what happened. And there was an avalanche of new material based on archives that had never been opened before. It was thrilling. And especially in the beginning, in those early days, Amazon and Google would allow you to search every single book they had all the way. I mean, I had access, these academic books are ridiculously expensive, you know, they're like $100 for a little book. But I could search every academic book, and through Academia and JSTOR and a couple other websites, I could research all the papers. And it was so exciting. I always found things that I just, I wish Manly Hall could have seen this. I mean, this is incredible. It changes the whole story. Just to give you one small example, people often, when they're talking about Rosicrucians, they talk about Robert Flood and Michael Meyer, and they say, well, they knew each other, they were friends, and they helped each other get published, and they must have been examples of real Rosicrucians. And academia got in here and started really digging through all this stuff, and what they found was they never met each other. And in fact, they didn't really like each other. They were critical of each other's work and had some very non-initiate things to say about each other. And it changed the whole picture of that. So I found out a whole bunch about the Platonists and about all these other things. And it was this entirely new view of American history. It was almost like, okay, you know the guy you think is your dad? Well, he wasn't. Your dad was actually this crazy outlaw artist person who did all sorts of stuff with indigenous tribes and the Spanish and voodoo. And you're like, what? And you go, oh yeah, you got a whole bunch of that. Your whole family tree is filled with people like that. And it was this alternate history of America. And not only did it give you these incredible characters who've been here since the very beginning. I mean, before there were colonies even, there were some very early visits here from people who were sent by the crown to see if there could be colonies. And the picture even of the so-called Christian origins changed radically. So for example, there's an author named Butler who analyzed what church attendance was like in the early days of America, the very early colonies and then onward. It was terrible. You had all these priests complaining, going, they won't come to church. We can't get anybody to sit in the pews. They just want to follow their own crazy ideas that they brought with them from the countries they came from. You had the idea that the Pilgrims, for example, were deeply Christian. I mean, you can't be more Christian than they are, and that they hated the occult and anything having to do with the esoteric. So wrong. And I'll give you an example of that. And the other thing that you see is that we have this rich alternate history of people who are sort of like forgotten founding fathers, people who have so much to do with the so-called American character in a way that people like you and I can actually appreciate rather than what we get taught in school, which leaves us going, well, my God, what's wrong with this country? I mean, the history is horrendous. These so-called Christians are one of the feet of the triangle of slavery, of the slave trade. And, you know, then it's an empire saying that it isn't, and it's going around manipulating the whole world and saying, no, we're a democracy. We don't do things like that. But then all of a sudden you discover, wait a minute, all this has been left out. So now let me give you a good example of that. And this will be, in the beginning, when the Pilgrims were here, a fellow was sent out named John Winthrop the Elder. And he was the head of the Boston colony, and he was a devout pilgrim. There were royalists in England who saw the Puritans getting this strong foothold in the New World, and they didn't like it because, of course, there was the Civil War vibe going on in England that was going to erupt into Cromwell. And you had the royalists on the one hand, the Cavaliers, who were guys with long hair. They usually had beards, and they wore cod pieces, and they loved Shakespeare. They were fighters and drinkers, and they loved wenching, as they called it. They loved women, and they were sort of jolly old England. And the Puritans were, don't run, walk fast, don't laugh. It's wrong to laugh in this world of suffering. And everything was deadly serious and so opposite. And they were headed for this horrible political showdown that would result in war with each other. And so they wanted to send someone, the royalists, who was going to maybe start a colony for the royalists there. Because after all, it was the royalists who started all that with Walter Raleigh, who was sent out to the Virginia colony. And they sent out a guy named Tom Morton. I call him the Pagan Pilgrim in the book. Tom Morton was a classic Cavalier. When he was a little kid, he saw the Armada in the Straits of England. Queen Elizabeth I was the monarch for most of his life. He was a lawyer. He was deeply into Shakespeare and into the great literature of Elizabethan England. He was like approaching 50 when he was sent out, which in itself, at that time, that was an advanced age. And he sails across the Atlantic to start this new colony. And he started it with a trading post. He named it Marymount. There was this beautiful little green hill that overlooked the Atlantic. And there he built this trading post, and he called it Marymount. One, it was the Mount of Mary, but it was also a pun in Latin about screwing, right? Mary Mount, but it was derived from Latin words. And he had a completely different approach, whereas the Pilgrims were convinced that Satan was everywhere in the New World, that the tribes were victims of Satan, and they could not be trusted, to such a degree that John Winthrop, the governor of Boston, once got caught out in the woods at night and became so terrified that he ran in a panic through the woods until he found a minstrel hut that one of the local tribes had set up, and he hid in the minstrel hut and chased off the women who were using it for the purpose it was intended, so he could hide in the shelter until dawn, convinced that there were demons all around him in the woods. Meanwhile, here comes Tom Morton, and he says, "Oh, tribes, awesome. So what do you guys believe in? What do you dream? How do you treat your elders? How do you teach your children? What kind of lives do you lead? And please, come to my trading post. I'll take care of you. I'll be fair with you. And also, by the way, outlaws, pirates, everybody's welcome at my trading post, not like the Pilgrims over there." He was also a hunter, and a very skilled hunter, and he fell in love with America, with how gorgeous America is. He wrote, for instance, this long piece about the different kinds of water that the tribes knew about in that area. There was one spring that came up through a crystal that was supposed to give you amazing dreams. There were other springs that were supposed to be healing for certain conditions, and he carefully wrote all this down. He became successful, of course, very quickly, and immediately aroused the anger and envy of the Pilgrims. So he decided to have a May Day celebration. May Day celebrations were very common in England, and he felled this giant yellow pine, and they stripped it and they put ribbons on it, and he wrote this really bawdy poem to a goddess of all things, and he had it pinned on there, and he had a big party, and he invited everybody. Again, smugglers, pirates, outlaws, all the tribes. And all he said was, while you're here, everybody gets along. No violence, no fighting. You put aside everything. Now, does this not sound like the other side of America, the side that we all want, right? As opposed to this puritanical, in control, we're better than you, judgmental side of America. So John Winthrop decides, okay, that's enough. A May Day celebration? So the Pilgrims start releasing propaganda in England that this party was an orgy, that everybody got together and got drunk, and that they were fornicating on the grass under the maypole, which was absolutely false. And what Tom Morton actually said in his book was, I got news for you, the indigenous women are way more moral than the lasses back home, okay? And nothing like that happened. It was the most friendly, wonderful gathering of people where everybody was talking to each other and learning from each other. So John Winthrop decided to take legal action against Tom Morton. And they were going to close down this trading post. He thought they're going to start a war against us or something. They're going to get all the tribes together and just take over, and that'll be the end of us. So Tom Morton, he was a lawyer, so he thought he could handle it. And he kept on doing what he was doing, which included selling guns to some of the tribes that had been decimated by the diseases that were brought over by Europeans, and who were now being attacked by bigger tribes who were trying to take them over and turn them into slaves, essentially. They were enslaving them. And he said, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to sell you guns so you can protect yourselves. I'll teach you how to use them. I'll teach you how to keep them clean. Well, the Pilgrims went nuts. They were like, he's training the tribes to come kill us. He's arming them with guns. What are we going to do? So they went in there and they broke the whole thing up, right? The first time they went in there, they smashed up the place and let everybody know, if you keep doing this, you're going to jail. They arrested Tom. They threw him in jail. Winthrop is spending all his time trying to find something to pin on this guy because he hasn't really broken any laws. So now it gets really interesting. At this time, the Pilgrims are already playing around with the idea of slavery. Like, they're going to become a fulcrum point of the slave trade. But what they're doing is they're taking people who've been arrested and condemned, and they're taking indentured servants, and they're throwing them into the very earliest of the tobacco plantations, where they live these horrendous lives as enslaved people until they die. And Tom, whenever he can, he tries to help people escape that fate, which is another thing that the Pilgrims hate him for. He warns people, I'll get you out of here. You go here and then go back to England or something. You're not safe here. And that was considered an act of treason to the Pilgrims, that they had judged this person and condemned this person to the punishment of working on one of these plantations, and this guy comes along before we can grab him and put him to work and spirits him off. We got to get rid of this guy. Well, to make the story brief, this part of the story, because there's an even better part coming up, Tom Morton fights this out for years, and he's got nicknames for all the Pilgrims that we grew up like looking at Disney movies and admiring them because they were so wonderful. And he's got nicknames like Captain Shrimp for Miles Standish, and he despises them, right? And one of the things that he despises about them is that when they arrest him in winter, they're starving, okay? I mean, they went to the point of cannibalism at a certain point. Even the way they're building their structures is wrong. They don't put any lime in it, and when it rains, their structures are melting down and breaking down around them. He's telling them, you need to put lime in it. If you put lime in it, it'll withstand the rain. They're like, that's satanic. You're trying to make us sick or something. And he says, okay, fine, but what about this? Let me go hunt, and I will swear to the Lord that I will come back and bring you food so that you people can survive. So they say, all right, if you swear, you can go get us food. He goes out there, he hunts for these idiots who've arrested him and disrupted everything he's doing, brings them back food. They separate the food out so that the poorest among them don't get any. And he says, okay, I will go hunt for the poor. It's no problem. There's so much food around here. People are starving, surrounded by food. And they say no. They say they're poor because God wills it that way, and they have to suffer. Well, he thinks they're idiots at this point, right? And eventually, this becomes a war in the courts in England, where he travels back and then comes back to America again. And there's like these changes in the government in England. And at one time, the Pilgrims were supported, then they support Tom. Then they withdraw their support from Tom and give it back to the Pilgrims. A real mess. And finally, the whole thing blows up when they show up in force to seize him. And he says that they would have killed him, that they acted with such ferocity that if there had not been a veteran there who protected him, he would have been killed on the spot. They take him away and they burn down Marymount right before one of the worst winters ever. And they bring the local tribes to see this, watch this place burn down. The tribes stand there and laugh at the Pilgrims because the tribes can tell from the signals that nature is giving that this is going to be a devastating winter. And they're just going, look at this idiot. He's burning down a good shelter right before one of the worst winters that we're going to see. And meanwhile, they starve Tom. They put him on an island. They maroon him. And they leave him with like sugar and almost no food at all. He would have died if the local indigenous people hadn't brought him food. And then they ship him off on a slow boat, meaning a boat that's going to make stops everywhere. Knowing that he's like in his 60s, he's probably not going to make it. He actually did get back to England, but he did not get back to America. And the Pilgrims, of course, totally won. And nobody knows about Tom Morton. It's almost invisible in our history. And this guy, and we'll leave him with this comment, he was the first person in America to publish a fart joke. He was the first person in America to publish a dick joke. He was the first person in America to be banned in Boston. He was the first person in America to be foreclosed upon by a corporation because the Pilgrims were incorporated. So he represented, when I looked at him, I just thought, well, he's us. Like, that guy's more American than the Pilgrims are. Then you start to examine the Pilgrims a little more closely. John Winthrop the Elder had a son named John Winthrop the Younger. Now we're going to get back to Rosicrucianism. So John Winthrop the Younger is in England while his dad is in America at first because he's a young man and he's studying. And he gets wind of the Rosicrucian manifestos and he loves all the occult stuff. He's fascinated by John Dee. And he wants to do what Father CRC, the founder of the Rosicrucians, did, which is he wants to go to Constantinople and find some of these masters, these invisible masters, right, that are going to teach me how to have their powers and to help the world be a better place. He tries this several times. He actually got all the way to Constantinople, but he never met anybody who impressed him. And he and his friend spent a few years searching out Rosicrucians whenever they could. And at the end of it, he decided, I haven't found one, but you know what I'm going to do? I love their ideas. So I'm going to live up to the Rosicrucian ideals. I'm going to be a Rosicrucian myself by doing the things that they say should be done. And he went deeply into alchemy at that point. So around 1631, his father says, come out here. So the Younger packs up all his stuff. He has acquired a lot of John Dee's library at this point and some of John Dee's alchemical equipment. And John Dee was the astrologer for Queen Elizabeth, was kind of the court wizard, was notorious for traveling in Europe as a spy and someone spreading these Rosicrucian, what would become Rosicrucian ideals and occult ideas, and eventually was discredited and considered to be some sort of evil wizard. But in the world of John Winthrop the Younger, he was a wonderfully learned man who was sort of the beginnings of science. And John Winthrop the Younger wanted to continue his work. So when he ships out his crates full of alchemical gear, and John Dee's manuscripts and books, he marks them with John Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica, an occult symbol. It's comparable to, I usually say it's like having a Southern Baptist preacher's kid put pentagrams on his luggage, right? Now, he gets to Boston, you would think that his dad would be like, kid, what are you doing? No, his dad's like, set up the alchemical lab in our house. I'm fascinated by this, keep up the good work. Well, John the Younger blossoms into this amazing character. I think he might be my favorite character in the book because he lived such an exemplary life in many ways. He found Boston very disturbing and too conformist for his tastes. He wanted to create a community where everyone was welcome. And he wanted to be somewhere where he didn't constantly have Puritans looking over his shoulder when he was doing alchemy and such. So he moved into the Connecticut wilderness, and he actually bargained with the local tribes to acquire some land out there. And he became the first governor of the territory of Connecticut. And he did very exemplary Rosicrucian things. For example, he was an excellent alchemist. He was very good at creating medicines. And he became a famous doctor in the world. People would travel all the way from Europe to this outlandish colony in America in the wilderness just to be treated by him. And he became the doctor for that whole area of New England. He trained women to travel in these areas, and he had various medicines that he put into specially colored packets, and he taught them to recognize certain symptoms and to prescribe the correct packet of medicine to the people who were suffering, and he did it all for free. Very Rosicrucian. Then, in his efforts to develop science, he started the first iron foundry in the area. And he needed these tools in order to create the things that he was trying to create. He also defended the weak and the innocent. When the Pequot tribe were being attacked by Uncas and the Mohegans, and Uncas, by the way, nothing like in the Cooper book or in the famous movie Last of the Mohegans. Uncas was a bully and a really violent, kind of rotten person. And the culture of the Mohegans at that time was a bully culture. So one of the famous stories was they would go find Pequots who had been devastated by disease, so there were very few of them, and say, hey, you want to gamble? And gambling with a Mohican meant you're going to lose because they're going to cheat. And if you don't lose, they'll kill you. And seeing this, John Winthrop the Younger decided to protect the tribe. Very dangerous for him to do this, as you can imagine, especially because the Pilgrims were supporting the Mohegans in this terrible action of trying to enslave these Pequots who'd already lost everything to disease. So John Winthrop the Younger negotiated, he appealed to reason, he even brought them, he moved the tribe to be right next to his community so that they would get a little bit of protection by being near him. And the Mohegans went in there anyway, and they broke their baskets and their pottery, they stripped them naked in the middle of winter and threw them in the freezing river, and they beat up anybody who tried to stop them. And there were Pilgrim supervisors watching this atrocity happen. Seeing that, John used the horror that it aroused in people, even amongst the Pilgrims of Boston, and got support finally to protect the Pequots. He fought to have the name of the tribe and their land restored, and even their names had been taken from them. They'd been given Europeanized names, and he fought to allow them to restore their original names. And so, really a remarkable human being. And the other thing that he did that was really wonderful was that all the colonies were supposed to provide soldiers for the crown. And he was expert at finding ways to prevent his people from having to go fight in wars. He would ignore the messages at first. And then when the messages became angrier, he would come up with great excuses. Oh, we're building this iron foundry and we need every single guy here working on it. But as soon as we're done, we'll send them out. So most of these people were able to survive without having to go back to England and fight in the war. And when John Winthrop the Younger died, Cotton Mather, now there's another pilgrim when you think of, and you think, well, he's held up as, he was behind the Salem witch trials to a degree, and here's a guy that was massively Christian. I mean, you can't be more Christian than Cotton Mather. But Cotton Mather was a dear friend of John Winthrop the Younger's, and when he eulogized him, he called him Hermes Christianus, the Christian Hermes. Now, whether he's talking about the Greek god Hermes or he's talking about Hermes of the Hermetic teachings, dude, I mean, Cotton Mather is complimenting someone by calling them Hermes Christianus. That's not the pilgrim that we thought he was. So that changed the whole picture. And the other thing that is part of the reason I wrote the book, aside from just wanting all this information that was unavailable to people to be available in one place, so you wouldn't have to do all the research that I did. And I had a lot of help from academics who were really kind and helping inform me. The thing that was very obvious to me in doing this was that the split that is in the country today was there then, and has been there every step of the way throughout the country. And an interesting side note on that is that behavioral scientists like Sapolsky, they say that if you want to identify a conservative from personality traits, that people who react with disgust to what they don't agree with are much more likely to be conservative.
I think that's true when I grew up, but I think it might be flipped a little bit now.
I hear what you're saying, absolutely. Well, it's infecting the whole culture at this point. I think everybody sort of has picked up this disease of blaming the other and distrust of the other. But that disgust, it was a difference. Like, to me, like, I look at Morton and John Winthrop the Younger, who are treating the natives as they are, these are human beings and we can learn from them and we should help them. And like Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, who learned the indigenous languages and then aroused the ire of Boston, of the Pilgrims, because he would not try to convert the indigenous tribes. He said that they had the right to their own religion. He talked about freedom of religion, and the need to separate religion from politics got him thrown out of Boston at that time. And so if you look at the Pilgrims, they're disgusted by Tom Morton. They're disgusted by the indigenous people. They're projecting their own kind of shadows on these people. So, there must have been an orgy and they were all drunk, and it's like, well, you wish, that's your fantasy. And feeling disgust toward that fantasy that they've invented. And here's Tom Morton saying, I want to meet them. I want to talk to them. I want to know what they know. I want to make a big melting pot of Marymount. So you really see there the split that's been at the heart of the psyche of America from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. That's well said. And that is a great overview of some of the really interesting stories that do weave throughout the book. You're right.